May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. In a makeshift prisoner of war camp outside the ruins of Aachen, smoke rises not from artillery fire, but from a controlled blaze in the center of a muddy courtyard. The air smells of wet wool and burned fabric. American soldiers stand at a distance, rifles slung low, watching as hundreds of German women in gray-green uniforms stand in formation, their faces pale and unreadable. The order has been given. They are to remove their uniforms, the very clothing that once signified their place within the Reich, and throw them into the fire. One by one, the women step forward. Some move quickly, as if shedding a skin they can no longer bear. Others hesitate, fingers trembling at the buttons of their tunics, eyes fixed on the flames that consume the fabric of their former lives. There is no celebration here, no cheers of liberation. Only silence, broken by the crackling of fire and the distant rumble of Allied trucks moving through the shattered streets of a defeated nation. The sky above is gray with spring clouds, and the ground beneath their boots is soft with mud and melted snow. This moment, repeated in camps across occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, would become one of the most psychologically devastating experiences for women who had served the Third Reich. This scene marked a profound psychological rupture for tens of thousands of German women who had served in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht, the SS, and other Nazi organizations. These were not the wives or mothers left behind on the home front. These were the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the signals auxiliaries, the Stabshelferinnen, the administrative assistants, the Flakwaffenhelferinnen, the anti-aircraft gun operators, and the concentration camp guards who had worn the uniform of the Third Reich with pride, with duty, and sometimes with fervor. For many of them, the uniform had been more than clothing. It had been identity itself. To burn, it was not simply to discard fabric. It was to incinerate a worldview, to accept that everything they had been taught to believe, about the Führer, about Germany's destiny, about their own place in history, had been a lie. The uniform had given them purpose, structure, and belonging in a society that had promised them a role in building an empire that would last 1,000 years. Now, as the flames consumed the wool and cotton, they were being asked to accept that the empire had lasted only 12 years and had ended in catastrophic ruin. The process of capturing and processing German women in military and paramilitary roles began even before the formal surrender. As the Allied armies swept across the Rhine and into the heart of the Reich in early 1945, they encountered not only surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers, but also thousands of women in uniform. Some were found manning communications posts in bombed-out bunkers, headphones still clamped over their ears as enemy tanks rolled past. Others were discovered in administrative buildings, still filing reports even as the roar of Sherman tanks echoed through the streets. And some, most notoriously, were arrested at the gates of liberated concentration camps, their hands still stained with the evidence of atrocities. The Allies had not fully anticipated the scale of female involvement in the Nazi war machine. Intelligence reports from 1944 had estimated perhaps 50,000 women in auxiliary roles. The reality was closer to 500,000. These women had not carried rifles into battle, but they had enabled the machinery of war and genocide in ways both visible and invisible. At first, Allied commanders were uncertain how to process these prisoners. The Geneva Convention had clear protocols for male combatants, but the legal status of female auxiliaries was murky. Were they soldiers, civilians, war criminals? The answer often depended on where they were captured and what evidence could be gathered about their specific duties. For the majority, young women who had served in communications or administrative roles far from the front lines, the determination was made to treat them as prisoners of war, subject to the same basic protocols as their male counterparts. This meant confinement in designated camps, interrogation to establish identity and unit affiliation, and eventual processing for denazification. It also meant, according to American and British policy, the removal and destruction of all Nazi insignia, emblems, and uniforms. The policy was clear. Every visible symbol of the Nazi state had to be eliminated. The women would be stripped of their military identity before they could be released back into civilian life. The process was designed to be both practical and profoundly symbolic, a physical manifestation of Germany's total defeat. The order to burn the uniforms was issued in late April 1945, as the camps began to fill beyond capacity. The rationale was both practical and symbolic. Practically, the Allies needed to prevent any possibility of escapees blending back into the civilian population while still dressed in military garb. There was also concern about the potential for organized resistance movements forming among former Nazi personnel, who might use their uniforms to maintain military structure and hierarchy. Symbolically, the act was intended to break the psychological bond between the prisoners and the regime they had served. Uniforms are powerful symbols. They signify belonging, purpose, discipline. For the young women who had joined the Nazi auxiliaries, many of them teenagers when they enlisted, the uniform had represented something more. It had been a mark of modernity, of participation in a grand national project, of escape from the narrow confines of traditional domestic life. The propaganda of the Third Reich had promised them a role in building a new Germany, a racially pure and powerful empire. Wearing the uniform meant being part of that future. To burn it was to acknowledge that the future had been built on lies, sustained by violence, and ended in ash. The women who stood before those fires in May 1945 had expected something very different from this moment of humiliation and defeat. In the final months of the war, as the Reich collapsed around them, many had clung to the belief that a miracle would yet save Germany. They had been told that secret weapons, the Wunderwaffen, would turn the tide. V-2 rockets would rain down on London and force Britain to sue for peace. Jet fighters would sweep the skies clear of Allied bombers. Underground factories would produce tanks faster than the enemy could destroy them. They had been assured that the Führer had a plan. That retreat was merely strategic repositioning. That the Americans and British would surely recognize the true enemy was Bolshevism and join Germany against the Soviets. Even as the walls closed in, even as Berlin fell and Hitler's death was announced, some believed the reactions varied as widely as the women themselves. Some approached the fire with mechanical efficiency, as if following orders was still the only thing they knew how to do. These were often the younger ones, the girls who had been drafted or recruited in the final desperate years of the war, who had never known adult life outside the regimented structure of the Nazi state. They unbuttoned their tunics with practiced movements, removed their caps with their eagle and swastika badges, and fed the garments into the flames without expression. Their movements were practiced, disciplined, the muscle memory of military routine carried forward even in the act of its own dissolution. They stood at attention even as they destroyed the very symbol of what they stood for. Others wept openly, their hands shaking as they pulled at buttons and seams. For them, the uniform represented years of belief, of service, of identity that could not be so easily discarded. Some had met their husbands or fiancés, now dead on the Eastern Front or missing in the ruins of the Reich, while serving in uniform. The cloth carried memories of dances in mess halls, stolen kisses in supply rooms, promises made under the shadow of war. To burn it felt like burning those memories too, erasing the last tangible connection to people and times that would never return. A few resisted, openly or subtly. They moved slowly, dragging their feet, hoping perhaps for a reprieve, a countermand, some acknowledgement that their service had meant something. Some turned their caps over in their hands repeatedly, tracing the embroidered eagle with their fingers as if memorizing its shape before consigning it to the flames. Others tried to remove their insignia patches first, attempting to pocket them as keepsakes before Allied guards intervened. The resistance was futile but deeply human, a last grasp at preserving some fragment of the identity they had worn for years. None of the hoped-for reprieves came. The fires burned steadily, fed by thousands of uniforms, and the guards watched impassively, ensuring that every woman complied. There would be no exceptions, no mercy for sentiment or nostalgia. The Nazi state was being dismantled piece by piece, and these women were witnessing the destruction of the part they had played in it. For some, the realization was devastating. For others, it would not truly register for months or even years. American soldiers overseeing the process later reported a sense of unease that stayed with them long after the war ended. These were not the hardened SS officers or concentration camp commandants who would face trial at Nuremberg. Most were young, many barely out of adolescence, and their confusion and distress were palpable. One American sergeant stationed at a women's POW camp near Mannheim wrote in a letter home, "They cried like we'd asked them to burn their own children. I don't think they understood yet what they'd been part of. They just knew they'd lost." His letter captured the strange dislocation of that moment. The guards were victors presiding over the dismantling of a genocidal regime, yet they felt no triumph watching these young women weep over burning clothes. Another officer, tasked with interrogating captured female auxiliaries, noted in his report that many seemed unable to comprehend the magnitude of Germany's defeat or the nature of the crimes committed in the camps. They spoke of the war in terms of duty and sacrifice, of hardship endured for the fatherland, but rarely in terms of ideology or atrocity. It was as if the uniform had insulated them from the moral reality of what they had served, creating a protective layer between their daily duties and the horror those duties enabled. Captain James Mitchell, who supervised a processing center in Bavaria, recorded in his diary that the women seemed to exist in a state of shock, moving through the motions of compliance without genuine understanding. "They are like sleepwalkers," he wrote, "going through the mechanics of surrender but not yet awake to what it means." He described watching a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, stand before the fire for a full minute with her uniform clutched to her chest before finally throwing it in. She had stared into the flames as if trying to understand something fundamental that remained just beyond her grasp. Mitchell wondered in his diary entry whether she would ever truly wake up, whether any of them would. The psychological mechanisms of denial and compartmentalization that had allowed these women to function within the Nazi system were still operating, still shielding them from the full weight of what they had been part of. The burning of the uniform was meant to break through those mechanisms, to force a confrontation with reality. Whether it succeeded varied dramatically from woman to woman. Some would spend the rest of their lives in that state of denial. Others would eventually awaken to a horror they could never escape. The fire itself became a symbol within a symbol, carrying meanings that shifted depending on who watched and who remembered. For the Allied authorities, it represented the beginning of denazification, the physical and psychological dismantling of the structures that had sustained totalitarianism. For the prisoners, it represented the end of certainty. Everything that had given their lives structure and meaning was being reduced to ash. The uniforms they burned were not elaborate. They were practical, utilitarian garments. Gray-green wool tunics, sturdy skirts, forage caps, and the occasional greatcoat for those who had served in colder climates. But each item bore the marks of the regime: the eagle and swastika embroidered on sleeves and caps, the insignia denoting rank and unit, the color-coded piping that distinguished signals personnel from administrative staff from anti-aircraft crews. These details had once mattered immensely. They had determined where a woman stood in the hierarchy, how she was addressed, what privileges she might claim, whether she ate in the officers' mess or with the enlisted personnel. In the fire, they were all the same. Rank and role dissolved into smoke, and the distinctions that had once seemed so important revealed themselves as arbitrary and meaningless. The smell of burning wool became, for many survivors, an olfactory memory they would carry for decades, a sensory trigger that could instantly transport them back to that muddy courtyard in May 1945. It was acrid, thick, clinging to skin and hair long after the flames died. Some prisoners later reported that they could not stand the smell of wool clothing for years afterward, that it triggered an immediate physical response: nausea, trembling, tears. The sensory experience of that day became encoded in their bodies in ways that rational thought could not process or dismiss. This was not merely the burning of cloth. It was the burning of self, the destruction of an identity that had been carefully constructed over years of service and propaganda. The smoke carried away not just the material of the uniforms, but the sense of purpose and belonging they had represented. They would spend the rest of their lives as ghosts of who they had been, unable to fully inhabit either their past or their present. Historical records show that the process was not uniform across all camps, reflecting the different approaches and priorities of the Allied powers occupying Germany. In some facilities run by British forces, the destruction of uniforms was accompanied by lectures on democracy and the crimes of the Nazi regime. Prisoners were made to watch films documenting the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, the skeletal figures and mass graves serving as grim rebuttal to any lingering belief in the righteousness of the cause they had served. The screenings were often conducted in silence, with guards instructed not to allow the prisoners to look away. Some women fainted, others sat rigid, eyes fixed on the screen but seeing nothing, their minds unable to process the images before them. A few broke down completely, sobbing or screaming, the reality of what they had enabled finally crashing through the walls of denial. The British approach was pedagogical, aimed at forcing a moral reckoning through confrontation with evidence. Whether it worked is debatable. Many women who viewed those films simply shut down, their minds refusing to connect their own service to the horrors on screen. They had filed papers, operated radios, served meals. They had not committed those atrocities. The connection between their mundane duties and the ultimate purposes those duties served remained, for many, too terrible to acknowledge. In American camps, the approach was often more pragmatic and less concerned with immediate ideological transformation. The uniforms were collected and burned, and the women were issued plain civilian clothing, often donated garments from relief agencies, mismatched and ill-fitting, a stark visual reminder of their fall from the regimented uniformity of military life. The clothes hung loosely on frames that had grown thin on wartime rations, and the colors, faded florals, patched woolens, worn cottons, seemed to drain what remained of their martial bearing. Women who had marched in formation now shuffled in ill-fitting shoes. Those who had stood at attention now hunched in coats that were too large or too small. The physical transformation was immediate and total. In the Soviet zone, where female auxiliaries captured by the Red Army faced far harsher conditions, the destruction of uniforms was sometimes accompanied by public humiliation, forced marches through liberated towns where survivors of Nazi atrocities spat and threw stones. Some women were made to wear signs identifying them as Nazi criminals. Others were paraded through the ruins of concentration camps, forced to view the evidence of genocide up close. The Soviet approach was punitive, aimed not at rehabilitation but at retribution. It reflected the Red Army's experience of the war, the millions of Soviet dead, the scorched earth, the deliberate starvation of prisoners. There was no sympathy for German women in uniform in the Soviet zone, only a fierce determination that they would pay for what their country had done. Yet even in the Western camps, where physical conditions were relatively humane and violence rare, the psychological impact of the uniform burning was profound and long-lasting. For many of the women, it was the first moment they were forced to confront their without it, they were individuals, accountable for individual choices. Some would spend years in internment camps, undergoing the slow and often superficial process of denazification. They filled out questionnaires, attended lectures, and received certificates declaring them acceptable citizens of the new Germany. Others would be released relatively quickly, deemed to have played minor roles and posing little threat to the occupation authorities. But all of them carried the memory of that fire, and all of them had to answer, in some way, the question it posed. Who are you when the uniform is gone? What remains when the symbols are stripped away? The answers were as varied as the women themselves, ranging from genuine remorse and transformation to stubborn denial and the construction of elaborate justifications. One woman, a former Nachrichtenhelferin named Else Kruger, later wrote in her memoirs about the day she burned her uniform, and her account provides one of the most detailed and emotionally honest descriptions of that experience. She had been 19 when she enlisted in 1943, drawn by the promise of adventure and the desire to contribute to the war effort after her brothers were drafted. She had spent 2 years operating radio equipment in a signals bunker outside Hamburg, decoding weather reports and coordinating flight paths for Luftwaffe bombers. She had believed, fully and without question, in the necessity of Germany's struggle. On the day she was ordered to burn her uniform, she wrote, "I felt as if they were asking me to erase myself. I didn't know who I was without it." She described standing in line with dozens of other women, all of them silent, all of them pale. She remembered the heat of the fire on her face as she approached, the way her hands fumbled with the buttons of her tunic. She had worn that tunic every day for 2 years. She had sewn a torn pocket, patched a cigarette burn on the sleeve, worn the fabric smooth at the elbows. It had protected her from the cold, from the judgment of civilians who might otherwise have questioned what a young woman was doing away from home. When she threw it into the flames, she said, she felt naked even though she still wore an undershirt and skirt. "I had nothing left," she wrote. "No identity, no purpose, no future. Just the clothes on my back, and the knowledge that everything I had believed was ash." Years later, after the camps, after denazification, after the long process of rebuilding a life in a country that had to reckon with its past, Kruger reflected differently on that moment. "Perhaps that was the point," she wrote, "to erase what we had been so we could become something else. But at the time, it felt like dying." Her testimony, collected in the 1980s as part of an oral history project on women's experiences in the Third Reich, reveals the complexity of that moment and the long shadow it cast over the rest of her life. She spoke of the difficulty of constructing a new identity, of the shame that haunted her when she thought about what her radio work had enabled: bombers guided to their targets, cities destroyed, civilians killed. She spoke of the temptation to simply forget, to bury the past and pretend she had been someone else during those years. Many of her fellow prisoners chose that path, she noted. They never spoke of their service, destroyed any documentation, and constructed elaborate cover stories about what they had done during the war. Kruger chose differently, eventually becoming involved in education programs about the Holocaust and the dangers of totalitarianism. But she always identified the burning of her uniform as the beginning of that long, painful journey toward. The fire consumed more than fabric. It consumed the narratives these women had been fed and had internalized over years of propaganda and indoctrination. The Nazi regime had been meticulous in its propaganda aimed at young women, understanding that mobilizing the female population was essential to sustaining the war effort. It had promised them modernity, purpose, and participation in a historic mission. The recruitment campaigns had used sleek posters showing capable, confident women in uniform, contributing to the defense of the fatherland. They had been told they were essential, that their work behind the lines was as vital as combat at the front. The regime had wrapped these promises in the language of duty, sacrifice, and honor, carefully calibrating its message to appeal to different demographics. For rural women, the promise was escape from the narrow confines of village life. For working-class women, it was respectability and upward mobility. For educated middle-class women, it was the opportunity to use their skills in service of something greater than themselves. And for many, the uniform had made those promises tangible. Wearing it meant being seen, being recognized, being part of something larger than oneself. To burn it was to acknowledge that the recognition had been hollow, the honor false, the purpose criminal. The propaganda had been particularly effective among young women from rural areas or working-class families, for whom the opportunity to leave home and serve in a military capacity represented a radical break from traditional expectations. In the conservative society of pre-war Germany, respectable women were expected to marry, bear children, and confine themselves to the domestic sphere. The Nazi regime, despite its rhetorical commitment to traditional gender roles through its celebration of motherhood and domesticity, had in practice mobilized women on an unprecedented scale. The contradiction went largely unnoticed by the women themselves, who saw only the opportunity to contribute, to matter, to be part of history. The uniform made that participation visible and legitimate. It transformed them from daughters and sisters waiting at home into active participants in Germany's destiny. Without it, they were once again just women, stripped of the authority and purpose the regime had temporarily granted them. The return to civilian clothing felt to many like a return to invisibility, to the traditional constraints they had briefly escaped. It was not just the loss of the Nazi identity that stung. It was the loss of any significant identity at all. They were no longer soldiers or auxiliaries. They were simply defeated women in a defeated country, with no clear path forward, and a past they were being told to repudiate. There were, of course, those who even in 1945 did not accept this transformation, who clung to their ideology even as the regime that had birthed it crumbled into irrelevance and disgrace. Among the prisoners were women who remained defiant, whose belief in National Socialism had roots too deep to be severed by military defeat alone. These were often the older women, the true believers who had been members of the Nazi Party long before the war, who had risen through the ranks of the Bund Deutscher Medal or the NS-Freundschaft, and had seen their service as a continuation of a lifelong commitment to the Nazi cause. For them, burning the uniform was an act of coercion, not liberation or purification. Some whispered among themselves that they would make new uniforms when the Allies left, that the cause was not truly lost, that history would vindicate them. They spoke of the war as a temporary setback, of the inevitable collapse of the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviets, of the day when Germany would rise again. But such voices grew quieter as the months passed, and the full extent of Germany's defeat, and the revelations of the Holocaust emerging from the war crimes trials, became undeniable even to the most fervent believers. Even fervent belief has limits when confronted with absolute ruin and overwhelming evidence of the crimes committed in the name of the ideology one has cherished. Among these true believers were women like Gertrude Skolzklink, the Reich women's leader, who had spent years crafting the image of the Nazi woman as both traditional mother and modern participant in the national project. Though Skolzklink herself evaded capture until 1948, living under a false identity, her subordinates filled the camps in 1945. These women had internalized the ideology completely, had taught it to others, had built their entire sense of self around it. They had lectured other women on racial purity, organized boycotts of Jewish businesses, coordinated the home front efforts that kept the war machine running. For them, the uniform represented not just participation but leadership, authority, ideological purity. To burn it was to admit that everything they had worked for, everything they had taught, Everything they had believed in had been monstrous. Most could not make that admission, not in 1945 and often not ever. They burned the uniforms because they were forced to, because the alternative was continued imprisonment or worse, but they did not burn the beliefs. Those remained, hidden but intact, carried forward into post-war lives where they festered in silence or found expression in the various neo-Nazi movements that would emerge in the decades to come. The symbolic weight of the burning uniforms extended far beyond the camps themselves, resonating through German society and the international community watching Germany's collapse. In the spring and summer of 1945, as Germany lay prostrate and occupied, the question of what to do with the remnants of the Nazi state was urgent and contested among the Allies. The uniforms were just one element in a vast process of denazification, but a highly visible one. Photographs of the bonfires appeared in Allied newspapers and propaganda films, used to illustrate the demilitarization and denazification of the German populace. The message conveyed to audiences back home was clear. The old Germany was being consumed, reduced to ash, so that something new and democratic could emerge from the ruins. Whether that new Germany would genuinely reckon with its past, or simply bury it beneath the rubble of reconstruction, was a question that would take decades to answer and remains contested even today. But in those first chaotic months of occupation, when the immediate priority was establishing order and preventing the kind of insurgency that many feared, the fires were a necessary symbol of rupture, a visible demonstration that the Nazi era was truly over and could not be resurrected. The images were powerful tools of Allied propaganda and historical documentation. Grainy black and white photographs showed lines of women feeding their uniforms into flames, watched over by stern-faced Allied soldiers with rifles. American newspapers ran these images with captions emphasizing the thoroughness of denazification, the determination to root out every vestige of Nazi militarism from German society. British newsreels included footage of the uniform burnings alongside scenes of concentration camp liberations, drawing an implicit but unmistakable connection between the women in uniform and the atrocities committed in those camps. The visual juxtaposition was designed to counter any sympathy viewers might feel for the weeping women. These were not innocent victims, but participants. The propaganda value was clear and immediate, helping to justify the occupation to war-weary populations back home. But the images also documented a genuine historical moment, a threshold crossed in the dismantling of totalitarianism. They stand now in archives as evidence of how regimes end, not just with military defeat, but with the methodical destruction of the symbols and structures that sustained them, and the forced transformation of the people who had inhabited those structures. For some of the women, the burning of the uniform was the beginning of a long, difficult reckoning with their past actions and beliefs. As the camps gradually emptied and prisoners were released, often with little more than a denazification certificate stamped with their classification, usually Mitteleufer or follower, the lowest category of Nazi involvement, and a railway pass, they returned to a Germany that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities were ruins, families were scattered or dead, and the social fabric had been torn apart by defeat, occupation, and the emerging revelations about the Holocaust. Many found that wearing the uniform, or having worn it, was now a source of shame rather than pride, something to be hidden from neighbors and employers. In the early post-war years, Germany was a place of silence and selective memory, where few wanted to talk about what they had done during the war, and fewer still wanted to confront the full horror of what the regime had perpetrated. The women who had burned their uniforms often burned their memories too, or tried to. They changed their names, moved to different towns where no one knew their history, and constructed new identities built on the thin foundation of denial and forgetting. The past became something to be buried, not examined, and the burning of the uniform became in retrospect a symbolic moment of severance, a point at which their involvement with the regime officially ended and could be left behind. But memory is not so easily incinerated, and the past has a way of persisting despite all efforts to bury it. Decades later, as Germany began the slow, painful process of confronting its Nazi past through trials, education reforms, and public memorials, some of those women began to speak about their experiences. Oral history projects and academic studies in the 1980s and 1990s sought out survivors of the auxiliary services, asking them to recount their experiences of the war years and the transition to peace. The testimonies were often fragmentary, defensive, threaded through with justifications and selective amnesia. Many women claimed they had known nothing about the Holocaust, that they had simply been doing their jobs, that they had been too young or too far from the centers of power to understand what was happening. But the testimonies also contained moments of stark honesty, usually from women who had spent the intervening decades wrestling with their guilt and complicity. Some admitted that they had known, or at minimum suspected, what was happening in the camps. The rumors had been pervasive, the evidence visible to anyone willing to see. Others confessed that they had been willfully ignorant, choosing not to ask questions because they feared the answers would shatter the worldview they had built their lives around. And a few acknowledged that they had believed in the ideology fully, that they had wanted Germany to win, that they had seen the war as just and necessary, and that coming to terms with the wrongness of those beliefs had been the hardest and most painful thing they had ever done. One particularly striking testimony came from a former concentration camp guard named Hildegard Lechert, who had served at Ravensbrück and Majdanek, and whose brutality toward prisoners had been extensively documented by survivors. Unlike most auxiliary personnel who performed administrative or support functions, Lechert had wielded direct power over prisoners and had used that power sadistically. She was tried and convicted as a war criminal, serving a lengthy prison sentence before being released in the 1960s. In interviews conducted decades later by researchers studying perpetrator psychology, she showed little genuine remorse, instead focusing on her own suffering during imprisonment. But she did speak about the day her uniform was taken from her after her initial capture in 1945, before her trial and conviction. "It was the only thing I had left," she said. "Everything else was gone, my home, my family, my country. The uniform was proof that I had mattered, that I had done something important. When they took it away, I was nothing." The narcissism and moral blindness of the statement were chilling to the interviewers, but it revealed something important about the psychological function the uniform had served. For women like Lechert, the uniform had been a shield against the reality of their own actions, a symbol that transformed brutality into duty, sadism into service. Without it, they were forced to confront what they had become, and most could not bear it. The result was not genuine remorse, but rather a retreat into self-pity and victimhood, a narrative in which they themselves were the primary sufferers of the war. The burning of the uniforms did not erase the past or transform the women who had worn them, but it marked a threshold that could not be uncrossed, a moment of rupture between the Nazi era and what came after. It was the moment when the illusion of the Third Reich's permanence was finally, irrevocably shattered. For the women who stood before those fires in May 1945, the world had ended in a very real psychological sense. The future they had been promised, the thousand-year Reich, Germany's racial empire spanning Europe, their own place as valued members of a victorious nation, had been revealed as fantasy. The identity they had claimed, built around service to the Führer and the fatherland, had been stripped away. The cause they had served had been exposed as criminal, genocidal, historically unprecedented in its evil. All of it turned to smoke and ash in a muddy courtyard under the watch of foreign soldiers who viewed them with a mixture of contempt, pity, and incomprehension. What came after was uncertain, undefined, and terrifying. The women were being released into a country that no longer existed as they had known it, divided among occupying powers, its cities in ruins, its economy collapsed, its very identity as a nation called into question. But the burning of the uniform was also, for many, the first step toward a reckoning that was long overdue, the beginning of a process, however incomplete and imperfect, of confronting what they had been part of and who they had become in service to a monstrous ideology. In the broader sweep of history, the burning of the Nazi uniforms is a small detail, a footnote in the vast machinery of demilitarization, denazification, and post-war reconstruction. Historians writing comprehensive accounts of Germany's defeat and transformation often omit it entirely, focusing instead on the major political decisions, the war crimes trials, the Marshall Plan, and the division of Germany into East and West. But for the women who lived through it, it was a moment of profound transformation that would shape the rest of their lives. It was the moment when the past became inescapable, when the future became unimaginable, and when the present demanded a choice: to cling to the ashes of what had been, or to step forward into the terrifying possibility of becoming something new. The choice was not made once, in that moment before the fire, but repeatedly over the years and decades that followed. Each time they were asked about their past, each time they saw a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, each time Germany engaged in another round of reckoning with the Nazi era, they had to choose again whether to remember or forget, to acknowledge or deny, to carry their guilt or displace it onto others. The burning of the uniform was the first of those choices, and in many ways the most visceral and unavoidable. The fires burned for days in some camps, fed by thousands upon thousands of uniforms collected from prisoners processed through the Allied detention system. The smoke rose into the spring sky, mingling with the smoke from the still smoldering cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and then it dispersed, carried away by the wind across a landscape scarred by war. The physical destruction was complete within hours, the cloth reduced to ash, and the metal buttons and insignia melted into shapeless lumps. But the psychological impact would linger for lifetimes, carried forward by the women who had stood before those flames and by the children and grandchildren to whom some of them, eventually, told their stories. In some camps, prisoners were ordered to stand and watch until the last ember died, a forced witnessing of their own transformation from members of the Reich to defeated captives of the occupation. The ashes were raked and buried, mixed with the muddy soil of Germany's defeat, indistinguishable from the ruins that surrounded them. Nothing remained of the uniforms but memory, and even that would fade with time as the women who had worn them aged and died, taking their individual experiences with them into silence. But the memory of those fires lingered in the historical record, preserved in photographs, military reports, personal diaries, and decades later testimonies. It lingered in the minds of the women who had fed their uniforms to the flames, a moment they would return to repeatedly in memory, understanding it differently as they aged, and as Germany's relationship to its Nazi past evolved through successive waves of reckoning. It lingered in the reports of the Allied officers who had overseen the process, many of whom found the experience more troubling than they had anticipated, confronted with the gap between the abstract necessity of denazification and the concrete reality of young women weeping over burning clothes. And it lingers still, in the archives and testimonies accessible to researchers and the interested public, a reminder that the end of a regime is not simply a political or military event marked by treaties and surrenders. It is a deeply personal reckoning, a moment when individuals must confront the gap between who they believed themselves to be and what they had actually become in service to power. The gap was, for most of these women, unbridgeable. They had believed themselves to be patriots, servants of a righteous cause, defenders of their homeland against enemies both external and internal. They had become enablers of genocide, cogs in a machine of industrial murder, participants in one of history's greatest crimes. The uniform had allowed them to avoid seeing that truth, had provided a comfortable identity that required no moral examination. Burning it forced them to see, whether they wished to or not, though many would spend the rest of their lives finding new ways to avoid that vision. In the end, the burning of the uniforms was an act of both destruction and creation, simultaneously ending one era and visible symbols of the Nazi state, the cloth and thread that had bound individuals to a genocidal regime. But it also created a space, however painful, however contested, however inadequately filled, for new identities to emerge and for some form of reckoning to begin. For some of the women, that space was filled with silence and denial, a determined amnesia that allowed them to function in post-war society without confronting their past. For others, it became the ground on which they slowly, imperfectly, built a new understanding of themselves and their place in a world that had been irrevocably changed by the war. The process was neither clean nor complete. Denazification was often superficial, more concerned with political stability than genuine transformation. The sins of the past were more often buried than confronted, especially in the early post-war decades when reconstruction took priority over reflection. But the fires marked a beginning, a moment of rupture that made some kind of reckoning, however inadequate, however delayed, at least possible. Without that moment, without the physical and symbolic destruction of the Nazi identity, it is difficult to imagine how Germany could have moved forward at all, how it could have begun the long process of becoming something other than what it had been. The ash settled, the fires died, and the women walked away, clad in mismatched civilian clothes, their futures unknowable and their pasts suddenly subject to judgment and revision. Behind them, the remnants of the Third Reich smoldered and faded into history, a 12-year catastrophe that had consumed Europe and murdered millions. Ahead of them lay a Germany that would have to learn to live with its past, to carry the weight of what had been done in its name, and to find a way forward that acknowledged both guilt and the possibility of redemption. The burning of the uniforms was not the end of that story. It was only the beginning, the first step in a journey that would span generations and remains incomplete even now, decades after the last veteran of that era has died. The real work, the work of memory, of justice, of transformation, would take far longer than anyone in 1945 could have imagined. And for many of the women who burned their uniforms in May 1945, that work would never truly be complete. They would carry the weight of that day, and all it represented, until their final breath, never fully resolving the tension between who they had been and who they tried to become. The fire had consumed the fabric, reduced it to ash and smoke that drifted away on the spring wind. But it could not consume the past itself, which persisted in memory and consequence, demanding acknowledgement long after the last uniform had burned and the last camp had been emptied and closed.